I was here at the inaugural event. I was honored to be here, and the great thing is whenever you've been at an event and they ask you back, great compliment. Just like in your practices, when the patients come back and they refer people to you, great thing. Several of you, I recognize faces in my breakout the other day, and oh, by the way, don't be worried. It'll probably be different because nobody's more surprised about what I say than I am. My background is a little bit different. A lot of the speakers prefaced their curriculum vitae with all kinds of training and things that they had studied to do and extra degrees at the end of their name and all these accolades. My claim to fame is I'm a dentist, I was a practice owner, and I'm a convicted felon. Went to prison for 19 months for healthcare fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. Not the greatest CV, would you say? And is it something I'm proud of? Absolutely not. It's something that is shameful. But what would be more shameful is if I didn't use what I learned to be able to help others avoid what I went through. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. And just as in the class the other day, is it okay to have fun with it? Is it okay? We were talking about prejudging people, our patients, something you should never do. So I travel a lot since I have been released from prison in May of 2010. So I speak a lot all over the country, and I was in Washington, D.C. at an event, and they had a reception at the hotel that afternoon. And I was in the lobby, and I was having a conversation with this lady that had walked up, and I struck up a conversation. Hey, how are you? My name's Roy. And she introduced herself, and I said, why are you here? And she said, well, I'm here for a meeting. And I said, well, that's nice, I am too. And she said, what kind of meeting are you going to? And I said, going to a dental meeting. And she said, oh, that's interesting. Where is it? And I told her, and I said, well, what are you here for? And she said, well, there's a mandatory training that we have to come through every year, and so I'm here for that, and the meeting is in such government building. And I said, well, that's nice. And she said, well, what courses are you taking? And I said, I'm taking these courses, but actually I'm one of the speakers as well. And she said, oh, that's cool. What are you speaking on? And I said, documentation, record keeping, billing and coding, things of that nature. And she said, that's interesting. Where's your practice, by the way? And I said, well, to be honest with you, I don't practice anymore. And I said, well, what is it that you do? And she said, I'm a federal judge from Texas. Don't get ahead of me, okay? So the conversation continued, and I knew where it was going. And I make a point to be honest and open because I want people to know about me on the onset, because there are people who will judge me and decide that they don't want to associate with me, and I want that to be up front, rather than not putting that out there for everybody to hear and wonder what they're going to do when they find out. So I was standing there, and she finally asked, she said, you know, well, why is it that you don't practice anymore? And I said, well, to be honest with you, I was found guilty of healthcare fraud, racketeering, and money laundering, and I spent 19 months in federal prison. And I expected her, because I'd prejudged her, that she would turn and run, dismiss herself as quickly as possible, but she didn't. She leaned in like this and she said, really? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? I said, yes, ma'am, I can. What would you like to know? She said, to be honest with you, I sentence people all the time. And I had no idea, have no idea what I was sentencing to. So could you describe that experience? So we talked for an hour and a half. Just as the story I shared the other day in our class, we prejudge people all the time. We cannot in our practice. We cannot in our practice. When they come in, you have to take them for who they are. Christy, great job. Great information to be able to learn how to be able to do that. The subject that I share is a little bit deep and dark, but I want your permission to have some fun with it. Is that okay? Have some fun today? Good. It'll go up and down and around, and I told them yesterday I have ADD, so it's going to go some places I don't even intend to go, but we'll go there anyway. Hope you'll go with me. But to give you an idea of what my life was like, I was a CE junkie, loved to be able to learn, and kudos for you. Doctors, for investing in your staff to have them here to learn. to learn and to train, kudos. Mahans, what a great example of great care of their clients to make this available. So a CE junkie, I had flown to California. I was in San Francisco for the American Dental Association meeting on October the 24th in 2003. Had flown from the western part of Virginia to this event, and I was in this huge auditorium, probably 4 times this size, listening to Rudolph Giuliani speak. 2 years after 9/11, he spoke on leadership. Did we watch him lead as that event happened when the 2 towers came down and they came together to be able to help to put things back together again? So he was speaking on this, and I was so into what he was saying that my phone was vibrating, and I didn't even notice it. The gentleman next to me elbowed me and said, "I think your phone's vibrating." I opened it, and it was my wife who was calling. Really unusual, because she knew I was in this meeting, wouldn't interrupt otherwise. But rather than answering the call, I'd had to stand up and walk out and have that kind of weird thing happen as I walked down the aisle. So I closed it, waited for Giuliani to finish. He was amazing. Called my wife, it connected, and there was silence on the other end. Now, if you know my wife, typically she's at least 2 words into the sentence by the time the phone connects. So the silence indicated to me she may not have even been there. So I said, "Debbie, are you there?" She said, "Roy, I am. Are you sitting down?" Have you ever gotten a phone call like that? Knowing that what you were going to be told was going to change your life. So all these things were going through my head, and Debbie was not home. She had gone to visit my daughter, who was at Virginia Tech at the time. And I said, "Debbie, what's up? Do I need to be sitting down?" She said, "Roy, you absolutely need to be sitting down." I said, "Why?" She said, "James called." James was our custodian. "James called to tell me that the FBI is at your office. They've battered down your back door and they're carrying out records." I said, "What? Are you sure?" She said, "Roy, I'm sure." So I talked to her for a few minutes, trying to reassure her, never thinking that it was going to be okay, because things like that just don't happen unless there's cause. Hung up the phone, and I was sitting there in now this empty auditorium trying to figure out what in the world I was going to do. Had literally felt like the wind was knocked out of me. Called my office, didn't expect anybody there. It was Friday, the staff would have been gone. After 2 rings, somebody picked up the phone. Voice on the other end of the phone said, "Hello?" I said, "Hello, who is this?" Voice said, "Who's this?" I said, "I'm Dr. Shelburne. I own the office that you're in. Can you tell me what you're doing there?" He said, "Sir, I have executed a search warrant. You are the subject of a healthcare fraud investigation. We're in the process of gathering evidence to determine your guilt or innocence, or whether we move forward in this proceedings." I said, "What is this about?" And to this day, the hair on the back of my neck still stands up. He said, "Sir, you know what this is about." I said, "I have no idea. I'm sorry. Do I need an attorney? I can't advise you. What's going to happen from this point forward, I can't tell you." Hung up the phone, got on the plane, flew back. Luckily, there were seats open. I was home about 9:30, drove and parked in front of my office. Crime scene tape wrapped around my office. Happened the weekend that our county had their fall festival. The next day, there were parades through town. There were booths set up on the sidewalk. And guess what the topic of conversation was? That was our office and our situation, exactly. Show you a little bit about my practice and where it's located. I had preconceived notions about what the system was like. Was so wrong. I'm going to share what I've learned through the process from this point moving forward to give you the tools you need to protect and defend your practices, because ignorance is no excuse. Do you understand that today there are a huge number of risks with the practice of dentistry every day that we're not aware of, don't even pay attention to, don't think about? But the way things, as they move forward, are they going to become more important? Absolutely. When government becomes more concerned and interactive in dentistry, Affordable Health Care Act, for example, is that going to change the way we operate? It absolutely will. Anybody want to quit dentistry right now and never practice again? My point would be that you should not live in fear. This is my family. The year after I was released from prison, we went to the not-so-scary Halloween party in Disney World. That was me. I was dressed as a pirate. I wanted to dress as a convict, but my family said that was way too obvious. I shouldn't do that. So I'm a pirate. You only need to be fearful if you choose not to do what you need to protect and defend your practices. Are there ways to be able to defend today? Absolutely. But if you choose to bury your head in the sand and not to listen and not to participate, could there be repercussions? Absolutely. Because, I'm sorry about the slides, they're hard to see. This was something for the 2 years I was on probation I had to carry in my pocket. It's a permission to travel. Because I was on parole, if I was found out of the Western District of Virginia while I was not carrying one of these, I would have gone back to prison and served that sentence, my probation in prison again. And my practice location, this is Virginia. I am as far west where it says Middlesboro, here, as you can. Richmond is here, as far from the powers that be, the state capital, as you possibly can be. So if you think your practice is isolated in a smaller part of the country and people don't know what you're doing or about your practice, I'm telling you it is absolutely not true. Electronics are such today that the government or any outside entity, the regulators, insurance companies, they know more about you than you would ever dream possible. And I'll be sharing that information with you as well. Because I've been found guilty of healthcare fraud, I'll never be able to own a firearm again. I lost my right to vote. As I said yesterday, this year, not a big deal. This was my practice. That was my grandfather's hardware store building. Graduated from dental school. My grandparents had passed away 2 years before I graduated. I set up my practice in this hardware store building back home where I lived. Population of my county, about 22,000. The largest town in the county, 1,800. That's 1800. The last year I practiced was 2008. The best year I ever had financially was the year after I was indicted and the year before I was prosecuted. You know how you'll diagnose treatment necessary for a patient and they'll postpone it for whatever reason? We don't have the tools we need to, or they don't have the money available to be able to get the work done, so they postpone it. That whole year, they would come into my practice and they would sit in my chair and the conversation would go something like this. Dr. Shelburne, you know that bridge we've talked about? I know I need it, and I want you to do it, but I don't know if you're going to be here or not. So could you do it now? They say any publicity is good publicity. I'd have to say yes. I wouldn't recommend you getting it this way, but literally the best year I ever had financially was that period. So I'm telling you, this is a take-home for you. If you think you have to give discounts, or if you have to do some weird kind of promotion thing to have your patient stay with you, not true. Not true. Was I as tainted as a professional can be? Absolutely. And let's put things in perspective a little bit as well. Professionally, what happened to me is the worst thing that could possibly happen by a professional, I would think. But it does not compare to loss of a family member or sickness of a family, so let's put that in perspective as well. It was bad, but to be honest with you, at this point in my life, I have been given a great blessing. I've been given a message and an opportunity to be able to share that with audiences like this, which makes what I went through worthwhile, because if I can save one other practice, one other office from going what I went through, it would have all been worth it. This was my home from August of 2008 to May of 2010. That's the prison camp in Manchester, Kentucky. When they sentence you, they'll typically put you in a facility that is as close to your home as possible, and I actually had a facility that was 4 miles from my home. And the reason why they chose not to put me in that facility is because the warden and 2/3 of the staff were patients of mine. Bottom line there is always treat your patients nicely, because they could have some kind of control over you later on, okay? So that may come back to haunt you. So rather than placing me here, they put me in Manchester, Kentucky, which is about 2 hours away from, and that's where I spent those 19 months in a prison camp. It's not a country club. It was It was horrible in that I was separated from my family, the people that I loved and the people that I cared about and that hurt for me. But moreover, I was taken out of society. They were still there, living in this community. Some people are supportive, some people are not. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along, because that time that you spend with me, I understand how extremely valuable that is. In fact, that, in my opinion, is the most precious commodity we have, is the time we spend. And the fact that you're spending it with me means the world to me. This is the indictment. It is the United States of America against me. Would that concern anybody here? It was a little disconcerting. Everything that the United States had to be able to bring against me to be able to make their case, they could. And hear me clearly. Did they do anything they weren't able to or could? No, they didn't supersede their power at all. So everything that I'm speaking about today happens very frequently. Got an email yesterday, as I do every day. There's an organization that put together all the actions against professionals, doctors, and dentists. There was one indicted yesterday. There was one sentenced 2 days ago. So as far as the frequency, it is becoming more and more frequent that actions are taken against us. I was charged with healthcare fraud, racketeering, money laundering, and structuring. Do I look like a mafia don, by the way? Maybe. Can they use those statutes against us? They absolutely can. I was indicted almost exactly 3 years afterward. This time of year gets a little bit melancholy for me, because both the search and seizure happened in October the 24th. This happened on October the 26th. So this time of year when the leaves are falling tends to remind me. So 3 years almost to the day after the search and seizure, I'd come home from work. It was a Thursday evening, changed into my usual clothes there. I had a t-shirt and sweatpants on, and there was a knock at my back door. Went to the back door, and the officer that I talked to on the telephone when I called home from California 3 years prior to was at my door. He said, "Dr. Shelburne, I'm here to arrest you." He came with 7 of his other friends. They came with 3 flatbed car haulers. As I was being read my rights, I'd been cuffed. I had handcuffs on. I had a chain around my waist tied to the handcuffs so I couldn't raise or lower my hands any further than this. I had leg irons on. So all I could do was shuffle. My wife was standing on my left shoulder with her right hand on my shoulder, and the phone began to ring. She turned to answer the phone, and the officer stopped her and said, "Ms. Shelburne, I can't let you answer the phone. We can't let anything interrupt the proceeding, so I ask that you not do that." She turned back around. She put her hand on my shoulder. Phone rang 4 times. The answering machine picked up, and my daughter, who was at the University of Virginia at the time, was on the phone. She was obviously very distraught. She was crying. But through the tears, we could hear her say, "Mom, Dad, they're here. They're taking my car. What's going on? What's going on at home? Is Dad okay? I don't need my car. Don't worry about that. But is Dad okay?" I was taken outside, put in the vehicle with 3 other officers, and they pulled the vehicles out of the garage and onto the flatbeds. Because I was charged with racketeering, money laundering, and racketeering, it allows the government to confiscate everything you own when you're indicted. Try to put together a trial, pay an attorney with nothing. Difficult? Absolutely. Impossible? No. Nothing is impossible. I was arrested. I was all assets. It wasn't just the things that we owned, but all the bank accounts as well. From that point moving forward, the only thing I was allowed to pay myself was enough to be able to service the debt. I had to pay everything I owed for, and the reason for that being is if I defaulted on one of the loans, they would be repossessed and the government could not take it. So I had to continue to be active on the payment of those notes. Spent a night in jail. They took me to the Bristol jail, and they put me in solitary confinement. They wanted me out of general population. They didn't want me hurt. I was escorted to the courtroom. The next morning, I walked up the steps. Never been in a courtroom ever in my life. The prosecutor was on the right-hand side at the table facing the judge, and my attorney and his paralegal was on the left, and I sat down and he said, "Hey, Doc, got good news and bad news." I said, "Okay, what's the good news?" The good news is I've arranged bail with the prosecutor, so you will be going home today. And I said, "Well, what's the bad news?" He said, "The bad news is for the prosecutor to agree to your release, you're going to have to surrender your license to practice dentistry." My life vaporized in that second. Everything I'd worked for educationally, for my family, for my practice, vaporized. Took a long, deep breath, and I said, "Well, if that's what it takes to get me home, I guess we'll have to do that." So the judge came in, and he asked the prosecutor, "What are the charges?" And the prosecutor said, "Healthcare fraud, racketeering." And as soon as he said racketeering, the judge stopped him and he said, "Sir, you understand that that statute was never intended to apply in a situation like this." And I thought, well, this sounds good. But the judge took a deep breath and he said, "However, the courts have ruled of late that that can be, so I'll allow it." Then it got to the bail piece, and what would typically happen, the judge would have looked at the prosecutor would have outlined the bail terms, and he would have looked at my attorney and said, "Are there any objections?" And my attorney would have said no, because they had already come to this agreement, so it was going to be a done deal, basically. So the judge looked at the prosecutor and says, "What are the terms of bail?" And the prosecutor said he needs to post this much bail, and we've asked that he surrender his license to practice dentistry. And rather than this judge looking at my attorney and asking, "Are there any objections?" he looked back at the prosecutor and said, "Sir, does the Board of Dentistry of Virginia still exist?" And the prosecutor goes, "Yes." Judge asked, "Well, are they aware of the situation?" And the prosecutor said yes. They had been in touch with the board because they wanted the board to take action on my license prior to being arraigned. And I had been in touch with the board because I wanted to make sure I wasn't doing anything I wasn't supposed to. So the prosecutor says, "Yes, the board knows about this." And the judge looks up and he goes, "Well, so you're asking me to supersede the power of another governmental agency that is responsible for determining whether or not an individual can practice dentistry appropriately in Virginia. You're asking me to supersede them, right?" And I'll never forget the prosecutor's face. He looked up and goes, "I guess." Judge says, "I'm not going to do that. Until the board acts on his license, he can practice." Went back, and like I said, the best year I ever had in practice was that following year. It was everywhere. 6 o'clock news, 10 o'clock news, 6 o'clock in the morning news. The interesting thing is, you know how roving reporters will stick microphones in people's mouths or faces and ask questions? They did that. They came to my town and actually found one of my patients on her porch. They shoved the microphone in her mouth and said, "Are you aware of Dr. Shelburne's situation?" She said, "Yeah, I am." "Well, ma'am, can you share with our viewers what you think of that?" She goes, "I'll tell you what I think. Dr. Shelburne's my patient, taking really good care of my daughter. And my daughter has 2 children. One of them has an appointment on Tuesday, and they're going to be there." There again, don't underestimate your patient's understanding of who you are, who your practice are. If you make that connection with them, they know who you are, regardless of what things on the outside are said. So be very clear about that communication. It went out on the AP. It was a story in the New York Times. I have a friend who practices in New Jersey, got the New York Times, and read my name, called and said, "What's going on with you?" So it was everywhere. The trial began a year and a half later, 9 days of torment. If you want to know what you do and how defendable your position is, this is one way to go through it. Like I said, I had a preconceived notion about how things went on. Anybody been on the jury pool before? Been on jury duty? Yeah? Several of you have. So how they went, there were 50 in the jury pool at this time, and the judge starts, when they choose jurors, having a conversation. Anybody who knows me, raise your hand. Patients of mine, raise their hand. Anybody who knows a prosecutor or anybody that's involved in the case, raise their hand. They were dismissed. And it left 35. And of the 35, there was 1 hygienist and there was 1 chairside assistant on that jury pool. And the way you go from 35 down to 12 is the prosecution eliminates 1, we eliminate 1, they eliminate 1, we eliminate 1, until we get down to 12. Two guesses who the prosecution eliminated first. Hygienist and the chairside assistant. They want nobody on that jury that knows anything about dentistry. They want our patients on there. And do our patients, are they sometimes confused about what we do? I think so. We'll talk a little bit about that later. The verdict was on March 6th. There were many providential things that happened, just like that judge determining to leave my license in place. This was another time. I was found guilty on all charges. They deliberated for a day and a half. They asked for none of the evidence, so they didn't review anything. They sat in a room and they talked. And 2 hours before they came back with the final verdict, they had a question for the judge that was shared with the prosecutor and with our team. If we find Dr. Shelburne guilty of racketeering and money laundering, do we have to find him guilty of healthcare fraud? The point is, if you're not guilty of healthcare fraud, you can't have committed the other two. So it appeared that they had found guilt in two, but not based on the fact that I committed healthcare fraud, which was opposite. To be honest with you, very complex legal jargon. As far as a normal individual, do they understand? I don't know that I understand, having gone through it. So that's the way our system works. So the people who are making judgment about us, it had to be a jury trial, just like a malpractice claim. And I always thought, from my point of view, if I ever got anything that I wasn't entitled to, I could pay it back with any interest, penalties, fines, anything that were associated with it. The best offer I ever got to settle was 3 years in prison and a restitution of $300,000. Best offer to settle. So the Supreme Court decision, another providential thing. 6 days before I was to be sentenced, 6 days, the Supreme Court defined a single word in the money laundering statute, which was proceeds. And my attorney read their decision and the definition. He said, the way the Supreme Court's defined this word, it doesn't apply in your case anymore, I believe. So he wrote a motion to the judge asking him to set aside the money laundering statutes based on this Supreme Court decision that happened 6 days before I was to be sentenced. So going into sentencing, there's a pre-sentencing report that is generated. It's based on what you're found guilty of, and because we in dentistry have a position of authority over our patients, that elevates the severity. The pre-sentencing report establishes the major or the most and least amount of time you can serve, and the judge would have to send you to prison under those two upper and lower time frames, unless there's reasonable cause. And so when I walked in, I was looking at a minimum of 15 years, a maximum of 27 years. I'm not a young man, so that may have been a life sentence for me. So walking in, I was thinking the best case scenario, if nothing changes, was 15 years. The judge began to explain that he was going to deviate from the mandatory. And as soon as he did that, my lawyer on my right-hand side and his paralegal on the left, he groaned, she cried. That's not a good sign, by the way. Found out that this judge had deviated in the past, but it was always upward, so they were thinking it's going to go beyond the 27 years. And he began to explain that the enhancements were inappropriate. Removed one altogether, halved one and left one in place. And that's by he set aside the money laundering charges, 5 of those, because he agreed with the Supreme Court's decision and my attorney's argument that it didn't apply. So by doing that, it reduced the minimum to 47 months, much better than 15 years, wouldn't you say? And he deviated beyond that, sentencing me to 24 months. And in doing that, that was a blessing. He could have set the verdict aside. Had that happened, I would have gone through the whole process over again. The prosecution would have got an appeal. We would have gone through the whole process. And by the way, the definition of that single word that the Supreme Court changed was changed back in another way 4 weeks later so that it would reapply in my case. So I had literally a 6-day, 4-week window of opportunity to be sentenced, or I'd still be there today. Providential? Yes. This is what the judge stated when he described. The defendant, which is me, argues that the evidence showed that he acted in good faith in his dental practice with no intent to defraud. Similarly, he contends that he acted with a legitimate medical purpose and within the bounds of accepted medical practice. I agree that his evidence supported such a defense, but there was substantial evidence to the contrary, and I think this sentence is key. A verdict in Dr. Shelburne's favor certainly could have been plausible and equally supportable. Under our system of justice, however, the jury's view of the evidence cannot be set aside, whereas in here there was substantial evidence to support it. Judge basically said it could have gone either way, and to me that would be reasonable doubt, but that's the reason why he deviated downward from what he did. The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it. I exchanged those 24 months of my life for my choice to not have systems to protect and defend my practice. Quite a price, wouldn't you say? Restitution, penalties, and fees. I practiced in Lee County, Virginia, which if we Googled MSN during the period, it's the poorest county in the state of Virginia. 92 to 95% of the 18 and under had Medicaid, so I had a very strong Medicaid practice. And in fact, so strong that I was number 5 as far as recipients of payments in the state during that period. During the period that they did the evaluation, 6 years, I was paid $3.5 million. Was that a large amount of money? It absolutely was. Of the $3.5 million that I got, how much do you think I got that I was not entitled to of the $3.5 million? Anybody want to throw a number out there? $1.5 million. Anybody else got an estimate? $2 million? Anybody else? Now the jury is never made aware of the amount. The amount is established during sentencing after I have been found guilty. The jury has no idea of the amount. Of the $3.5 million I was paid during that period, the amount that I got that I was not entitled to was $17,899.57. That's 0.5% of the amount that I was paid. And even though we were able to establish there were work that I provided for my patients, didn't bill for, should have, and gotten paid for, in excess of this amount, it didn't make any difference. So as far as the amount being of a concern to the government, no. Insurance companies, will they bring action against your practices and against your doctors? Absolutely, but the money needs to make sense. It'd be a heavy hitter, a lot of payments made and made inappropriately. Will you get dinged by the insurance companies? You absolutely will, but the government is all about sending a message. RICO forfeiture, when they sold everything, $200,000, fines and penalties, $75,000. Okay, by a show of hands, how many of you in this room pay taxes? Better everybody raise your hand or you're going to be in the same place I was, okay? There are rules and laws against that. So, you as a taxpayer, how much did you pay to investigate and prosecute me? Conservative estimate, $1.3 million. The fraud agency in the western part of Virginia spent 3 years doing the investigation. They interviewed everybody and their brother. They involved expert witnesses. They did the forensic studies. They spared no expense. I mean, and I thought during the trial it would be their side against our side. We had experts who actually testified on my behalf, and they did on theirs. And I was thinking, well, that's reasonable doubt. And oh, by the way, the expert who testifies against you may be reimbursed based on the amount that you're found guilty of. Kind of like the RAC audits today. Are you familiar with RAC audits? They can audit your practice, and the person who is doing those audits are reimbursed based on what they find in error in your practices. Is that dangerous? That is terrifying to me. But that's the world we live in. Cost to incarcerate me, $3,500 a month. This is more now, so $66,700 or $500 to keep me in prison during that period. For my parole officer to generate those forms, $250 a month, $7,700. Cost to regain the $17,899.57, $1.374 million. I would ask you where the fraud is, but that's just me. I guess I have a skewed view. Life is 10% what happens to us and 90% about how we react to it. Unfortunately, I am out there enough that people going through the same thing or having gone through the same thing contact me. And it breaks my heart, what it's done to their lives, what it's done to their families. And a lot of people ask, why me? And my answer is, why not me? I had a faith that sustained me, a family that loved me, and a goal in my life to make sure I was the last one it ever happened to. When, regardless of where you're starting in your practice, I can tell you, can you change it? You absolutely can. Because if I'm here today, if I've been recognized as an American Dental Association subject matter expert, I get to speak at meetings like this, as well as nationals, the ADA, the Chicago Midwinter, the Greater New York. It's an honor, and it's been a great gift, because I see a lot of people who have gone through the same thing and have been devastated as a result of. And my story to you is you need not let anything that's happened, regardless of what's happened to you in your life, change your trajectory. Sometimes will you change your course or have to do course adjustments? You absolutely have to. You're probably asking, why does this apply to me? I don't take Medicare, or Medicaid, excuse me. Did you know that Medicare, if you see a dependent of active duty, if you see a federal employee, anybody who is covered by the American Affordable Health Care Act, all those are reimbursed by some degree by government funds. So the same laws that rule Medicaid rule in every single one of those situations where government is involved in any way. And if you don't think government's getting deeper into dentistry's pockets, you are burying your heads in the sand. They're going to get deeper and deeper in what we do. You know, the argument could be, I don't take Medicare, or the staff does that. So do we need to be aware, doctors, that we are the people who bear the responsibility regardless? Let's talk about today's environment. You know, this was a Medicaid issue, but will insurance companies come after you? They absolutely will. Boards of dentistry, what is the one thing that you can do to minimize or eliminate malpractice claims against you and your practice? Anybody want to throw out how you do that? Records, that's a great one. Documentation, a great one. Anything else? Have patients like you. Patients who like you do not sue you. They pay their bills, they keep their appointments, and they refer patients. Patients that like you, can you kind of mess up and they are okay with it? They'll let you fix it. I do board-ordered remediation and record keeping for doctors, and what I see, and seeing greater frequency of, are doctors who have a complaint against them against the board, and the board has to start an investigation. And in most of the cases, the treatment provided is standard of care. It's great. But they read the documentation, and that documentation is substandard. So the doctor gets dinged because of the documentation, and that becomes a part of that discoverable record for that doctor. Have one doctor, to be honest with you, she's one of the best clinicians I've ever seen. If I needed to have something done, I would sit in her chair without any hesitation. She has had, in the last 5 years, 11 board complaints. First time I had an interaction with her, her treatment was fine, but her records were horrible, so she had to do some remediation. Did not learn her lesson. 2 years later, another board complaint, same thing. They noted that her records were incomplete, inappropriate. So she had to do it all over again with double the time, and there was a review that I needed to be able to do and send to the board. This lady, like I said, clinically was phenomenal. She was not a nice person. So that's the reason why she got all the malpractice claims. And let's talk about malpractice claims. You may be able to read this, but this is the latest breakdown of the frequency and the amounts that are paid. Your documentation, as you mentioned, is going to be a great defender of your position. There are so many attorneys now that they're looking for business, and they'll actually troll or send out ads. Have you been damaged, or is there an issue with your dentist or your doctor? And the first thing they do once they have that conversation with the patient is they're going to ask for your clinical records. And if those records are complete, they defend your position, they are able to substantiate the fact that you did exactly what you're supposed to, those cases disappear because attorneys don't want to have to fight that battle. But if there's wiggle room in what they read, you can interpret it one or two different ways. Is there an action pending? That could very well be the case. And I told you, regardless of where you are in the country, can you hide? You absolutely can't. Doctors, practice, business people, every single claim that is submitted to an insurance company profiles that practice. They compare you with every single other doctor in the area as far as things like how many surgical extractions you do as opposed to your regular extractions, how many core buildups you do before your crowns as opposed to your crown placements, how many crowns do you do in general, their scaling and root planing, your frequency of that, and Dr. Normal is flat in the middle of that bell curve. So are they going to come after Dr. Normal? No. You're doing the same thing everybody else is, but when you start moving out 1 or 2 standard deviations from that center to this right-hand side, 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, and 3 standard deviations, doctors, you're standing out there by yourself, and what you're doing is so off from everybody else, ding, 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 the red flag goes on, and you will be audited more than likely. They say it's a random audit. I can tell you there's no such thing as a random audit. I'm a member of this association, the American Association of Dental Consultants. Those aren't the consultants that come to your practice and help you do what you do more effectively. These are the doctors that look at your claims and determine whether or not they're going to pay them, whether or not that PD is going to be improved, and the insurance companies are there as well, talking about us and what we do, and how dentistry has become very active in fleecing their plans of money. And you figure out where they're focusing that and where the issues are. So, standard deviations, chart reviews, and if you're this doctor who is out here by themselves just doing more than anybody else and the money makes sense, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars out of kilter, will they put together evidence and start a criminal proceeding against you? They absolutely will. So just FYI, it's not just the government that's doing that, everybody is. If you're feeling pressure and financial changes, this chart is of the income of dentists and dentistry in the past since 1981, when I opened my practice, to 2013. And you can see a steady climb, steady climb, steady climb, steady climb, and then 2005, 2006, and 2008 and 9. What's happened? Our incomes have bottomed out. Part of that is because our patients are very different and what they accept is different, and insurance is changing, correct? That indemnity plan, which paid, when I first went into practice, 80%, 20%, and there was no such thing as UCRs, they just paid you. Those days are long gone, and insurance companies are now having to provide a very cheap product for their employers to be able to keep their employees taken care of. So where does the buck stop? Doctors, that's you. Unfortunately, regardless of who is actually processing the information, that is you. So everything that's in the record, everything that's coded correctly, incorrectly, everything that's billed to the patient, everything that comes in and out, doctors, the buck stops with you. But oh, by the way, my friends who work with the dentist, you're not off the hook either. There's a case in Texas of an oral surgeon who did not own his own practice. He rotated through 6 different practices in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They indicted this oral surgeon for healthcare fraud. They indicted his business manager for healthcare fraud. They indicted his chief assistant for healthcare fraud. They indicted the 6 doctors who provided space for this doctor to practice. So they got everybody and the pony they ran in on. In this particular case, the employees of the doctor, the business manager, and the chairside assistant, they removed the indictment against them in exchange for their testimony against their doctor. They turned them. The 6 different dentists who provided space for this dentist to practice, and one of them, by the way, was a state senator from Texas. So if you think there's any kind of protection now, look at what's going on with Hillary. You know, as far as criminal action, they are no respecter of positions or persons. The 6 doctors who were indicted as well, they removed the indictment against them weeks before it went to trial, and the least amount any of them had paid was about $300,000 to defend their position. So who won in this case? Nobody. This oral surgeon was found innocent and lives in fear today that he will now be indicted civilly. I was found guilty criminally. 2 months before I was to be released from prison, 2 months, I was called to the administration office. I was served with papers indicating that I was now being sued civilly. So you can be found criminally guilty and civilly guilty, just like OJ. Learned my lesson on the second one. I just paid what I could. The amount I had left, the last bit I had in my life, I said, this is all I have. I'll pay you if you will drop the case. They took it. leaving nothing, literally nothing. So it's a scheme to defraud. So anybody involved, that is from the custodian to the doctor, can be indicted. And they do that in the event that they need some leverage against perhaps somebody who will testify against the doctor. So is that a scary world we're living in? It absolutely is. It's terrifying. And the thing that I didn't understand is the legal definition of intent to defraud. I thought you intended to defraud if you sent a claim in for a patient you never saw for a service you never did. Absolutely, that's intent to defraud. But this is from a slide deck from the government teaching doctors and dentists about the risks that are involved. It states that the False Claims Act, no specific intent to defraud is required. The False Claims Act defines knowing, which means knowing you're committing fraud, to include not only actual knowledge, but also instances in the person acted in deliberate ignorance or reckless disregard for the truth or falsity of the information. Reckless disregard means if you continue to do the same thing the same way and not have systems in your practice to identify and correct those mistakes, that is construed as intent to defraud. Did we make mistakes in our practice when we billed? Yes, we did. We got paid things we weren't entitled to. Did we have systems to identify and correct those errors? We absolutely did not. And by the way, the False Claims Act actually states this. If they, as in the processing agency, when you send the claim in, pays a claim and pays it inappropriately, pays you something you're not supposed to get, you, the receiver of that payment, have the responsibility of identifying their error and returning it, and it's within 60 days, or you are responsible. Can you be found responsible of fraud in that event? They can. Ignorance is no excuse, like I said. You have an obligation to know about HIPAA, about OSHA, about any regulations that have bearing on your practice. It's not up to them to teach you how to do it, so you need to be proactive in your approach. When things change, you need to change with what's happening. For example, the contracts, if you are in network with an insurance company, they can change that contract unilaterally, and all they have to do is give you notification. They can send you a letter. So if you've ever gotten that letter from the insurance company and start reading and just toss it in the trash can, read the whole thing. Because it may start with a paragraph like, we're so happy you're with us in this network, thank you for being a part of this, blah, 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 and then the third paragraph down it says, and oh, by the way, we're now going to make you available to the discount plan in our area so that you're now in network with that discount plan. So if you had a patient walk into your practice with a discount card in their hand and you're going, we're not in network, and then you go online and find out, sure enough, you're listed there. What's happened is they basically slammed you. They made you a part of this network without anything other than the notification that they are going to do that. In most cases you can opt out, but only within their time frame. They can say, if you notify us in 30 days to opt out, we'll take you out. So make sure that any of those correspondences you get from the insurance carriers, even though it looks like junk mail, because they try to make it look like junk mail, read them. Because they may have changed that contract without you knowing. What lies behind us, what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. Your character is everything. Character allows you to sleep at night. Character lets you know who you are. And if you're true to that, people will gravitate to you because there's so many people in the world that are fake. You know any of those? Any frenemies in your life? That's a friend to your face, an enemy behind your back? Boy, did I find out who those were. It is invaluable information. So what caused the action? To this day, we'll never know, actually. Most of the time, if it's a Medicaid action, the doctor has been non-compliant with the Medicaid offices, and you get in trouble with, in my case, it would have been Virginia Medicaid. Never an issue. Prior to this, 4 years prior to, I had a Medicaid audit that came back clean. So someone made a complaint to the fraud division of the Western District of Virginia, and just like a board complaint, they had to do an evaluation. So what they did is a review of my records, kind of like that bell curve thing. There was a whistleblower, and the person who makes the complaint is protected. You'll never know who they are. Oh, and by the way, if they make the complaint and they're lying through their teeth about what they determined was going on, there's no recourse. If they've lied one side down the other, made up the whole thing, they can't come back against that person and say, you lied, we're going to take action against you. They cannot. And oh, by the way, the person who's making the complaint can get up to 30% of what's regained. In the Northeast, there's a large corporate chain who was actually found to be paid $3.5 million more than they were entitled to. Single whistleblower got 30% of that. Do the math, that's $1 million payday. So do we live in a world that's kind of scary? We do. So somebody made the complaint. They did my records review. Was I out of kilter? I absolutely was. If a patient came in and they needed full mouth reconstruction, I did that. I didn't extract and send them home. I treated every patient as if they were the wealthiest patient in my county. Do you all have meth mouth in this part of the country? Yes. You seen what it does? We would have patients that would have a drug problem, and we would try our best to get them clean and sober, and if we did, we put them back together again. So we had some pretty significant cases. We did a lot of work. Proud of those that we did. And some of those individuals have gone on to have very productive lives. So were we out of kilter? Absolutely. Like I said, I was number 5 in the state of Virginia, not to brag, but that's just the number. So that recommended further investigation. They actually sent letters home with 15 of our patients to come to a classroom. They wanted to evaluate clinical treatment in Southwest Virginia, and they did that evaluation in a classroom with a flashlight, and that triggered the search and seizure. That triggered their breaking down my back door and taking out my records. Never had a conversation with me, never started a dialogue, had no way to be able to defend myself at all. So moving forward, the investigation continued. When I flew home from California, went by my office that evening. The next day, I called my staff. I asked, does anybody have any idea what's going on? And they said, we have no idea. I said, can we get together? We sat together, had a large staff at that time, had 2 front desk person, had 3 chairside assistants, 2 full-time hygienists in a 5-chair office. They said, we have no idea. Went to church the next day. Like I said, everybody knew, stood before the congregation. I asked, could you please support us? I don't know what's going on. We're trying to work through this, but if you'd support us, I'd sure appreciate that. Next day, my pastor came across the street after we had the first day back. He came to the front desk and I said, can I speak to Dr. Shelburne? And she came to get me and I said, I'd love to see him. Go ahead and put him in my office. Finished with my patient, went into my office, shook Randy's hand. I said, Randy, I'm so happy you're here. He said, after I tell you what I have to tell you, I don't know if you'll be happy or not. I said, Randy, what's up? He said, I had a couple of visitors today. Oh, who'd you have visit? I had a prosecutor and an investigator come to our practice, or come to our church office with a subpoena. I said, really? They subpoenaed the recording of that church service. They wanted to know what you said because they thought you may have said something to incriminate yourself. That was my life from that point moving forward. They actually sent 3 teams of officers about a year and a half after that search and seizure. Got a call from one of my daughters who began to explain, and we found out that 3 teams of officers simultaneously, same day, same time, went to the 3 children's universities, went to the bursar's office, got their schedules, enlisted help of campus police to direct them to the location of that classroom. The officer banged on the door of that classroom, walked in, flashed his badge to his professor, or their professors, and said, we need to interview these students. They pulled my children out of their classrooms into an empty classroom and interrogated them. As a parent, what do you think that did to me? I was so angry. I was so hurt. I was so scared for them. I said, could you please come home? We talked. I'd like to talk to you this weekend. So we were sitting in the living room, and I said, kids, I can't stand to watch this. I'm a big guy, I can take it, but it looks like it's going to affect you, so I can't stand to watch that, so I'm going to plead guilty to anything they want to charge me with. I can't stand to watch this. My daughter stood up with her finger in my face, and she said, if you do that, I will never forgive you. And the other 2 stood up and said, you're right, we're fine. We can get through this together. And I said, well, the deal is if I ever see anything in your life that would indicate to me you're not becoming who you can become and being what you can be, I'll pull that trigger because I can't stand to watch it. So before we get done today, I'll tell you how that ended up. But every business that I did business with, they pulled those records. Colleagues, they interviewed all the other doctors in the area and asked about me. Doctors, if you want to know what you're thought about in that community, this is one way to find out. I wouldn't recommend it either. Had some surprises both ways. Some doctors were extremely supportive, other ones not so much so. I can tell you when we first started the process and was indicted and tried to have doctors identified that would testify on my behalf, we sent the same allegations and records to 15 different dentists in the area. Every single one of the 15 came back and they said, there's nothing that you've been accused of that hasn't occurred in our office. So I encourage you to look at your systems. They actually, after the search and seizure, they instructed Medicaid to do audits. The first one was truly random, and it came back clean. The second one was they pulled the 15 patients that I'd done the most comprehensive work on. So I recognized the patients as having had a whole lot of work, so I went to my software, I pulled the patients with Medicaid and the descending amounts paid. So the 15 patients we'd done the most work on, the most amount of work on, were the ones I pulled. And this is a copy of the facts that came back between Virginia Medicaid and Doral Dental, who is now DentaQuest, the administrator of Virginia Medicaid. Based on Doral's response to DMAS's questions, Doral indicated that the clinical issues were minor in quality, dollar value, quality record keeping based on available documentation for review, and appeared consistent with audit findings of other practices in Doral's other markets. Doral would not have any major concerns with Dr. Shelburne based solely on these audit results. Medicaid said, we did our review, we don't have a problem, and I was able to see Medicaid patients until the day I surrendered my license. They didn't suspend that or payment to me because Medicaid says we can't see any issue. And the government's response to this was, well, you just don't have the expertise we have to go to the depths we've gone to determine this man is committing healthcare fraud. So question to you, if I gave the same set of records for one patient to 5 of the dentists in this room, how many different treatment plans would be generated? Probably 7 or 8. A couple of you couldn't figure out one, you do 2 or 3. So if you would ever think the thing that you did or the decision you did would not be challenged by somebody else practicing dentistry, you're dead wrong. There is so much difference of opinion that it is scary. And what do our patients expect? The number one reason why people post negative reviews on Yelp is because they went to a subsequent dentist and the treatment that was recommended by dentist number 1 did not track with dentist number 2. The dentist number 1 suggested that patient have work done that the dentist number 2 said it was absolutely unnecessary. Lesson to you when you go home, break down your treatment plans into 3 distinct topics. Number 1, emergent. Those are the things that the patient absolutely needs to have today or tomorrow or there's going to be an issue. They're going to have an infection, they're going to lose a tooth, something's going on. Number 2 are those things that are actively disease processes going on. That's periodontal disease, that's decay. 3 are those things that you would give the patient to put them back into optimum care. That may be implants, bridges, partials. This is going to help to triage your treatment and it'll also have the patient able to understand, okay, dentist number 1 gave me soup to nuts, broken down in a way I can understand it, and dentist 2 only did maybe group number 1 and group number 2 and didn't do the other. So a patient can understand that way. It gives them a comparison to be able to do, and it also helps you triage. Heaven forbid, and shame on you, if you start with group number 3 and leave out group number 1 and 2. Shame on you. Only triage and treat according to need. Now that doesn't mean if you've got an emergent issue and a quadrant and you do 2 and 3 in there too, fine. But don't go after the big bang for the buck. So who's right and who's wrong? Professionally, we can look at and go, okay, that's a difference of opinion, practice philosophy, but when that goes into the legal realm, that is a malpractice claim, that is a legal action. Anytime they can find another professional to testify against another, then it's you. And I would just suggest to you, judging a person does not say anything about what they are. It says volumes about who you are. Never throw stones. If you have an issue with another practitioner, always start that conversation with the other practitioner. Hey, this patient came in, I've got some concerns, can you tell me what went on here? If you were a doctor and were in that situation, wouldn't you like to have that conversation rather than the doctor jumping to conclusion and saying something bad to that patient about the subsequent doctor? Never do that. Never do that. Specific allegations, we're going to go through these fast and then I'm going to break them down into smaller parts. Upcoating, unnecessary treatment, overtreatment, x-ray did not show the need for treatment, no sealant present, no restoration present, second billing for services, unbundling multiple extractions, one visit, billed multiple dates, multiple services. I'm going to break these down. This is the list of everything, but I'm going to give you independent listings about some of the specifics. Sometimes you have to forget what's gone, appreciate what still remains, and look forward to what's coming next. You know, there were times when something would happen, there would be another domino that would fall, and I would think, I just can't go any further. I just don't have strength to do this. But what I did find is if I had the strength to look what was going on and what I was involved in, some of the things I was trying to carry and drag along with me, if I decided to drop some of that baggage, I could always have the strength to move forward. So you need to do a little bit of self-assessment. If you're feeling stressed out, if you're feeling like you don't have the strength to go on, I encourage you to sit down and go, okay, what can I do without? What's unnecessary? And spend your time on those things. Upcoating. Anybody been in dentistry since before '05? Yeah, we got some. Good for you still being in dentistry. There used to be 2 codes for extractions, kind of like PAs now, first PA, additional PAs. There were 2 codes for extractions, first extraction, additional extractions. So occasionally, this didn't happen all the time, but if we did 3 extractions, all of them were coded as if it were a first PA. We coded it as a 7110 first extraction for all 3 of them. It was all on the same day. It was all in the same claim form. And generally, when they would review that, you would think they would go, that did 3 extractions on this day. They would either remap the second 2, or they wouldn't pay them at all because they were in error. They didn't. They paid them at $2.64 more than we were entitled to. Should we have caught that and sent it back? We should have. We didn't. That was one of the instances. They had 118 instances that they brought before the court that could have been construed as healthcare fraud with 1 count of healthcare fraud. So they had 118 chances to prove my guilt. So surfaces restored. There was an issue about whether or not that was an OB amalgam, or back in the day I was doing amalgam. So the issue was I had billed for an OB amalgam on tooth number 19. And their expert witness said, I've reviewed the radiograph, and that radiograph does not indicate there are 2 restorations on 19. So if they're superimposed, would it look like 2 separate restorations? It wouldn't. Do our patients know the difference? No, they don't. So did the person who was testifying lie? No, they didn't. Unnecessary treatment. They had a practitioner that said if any of the lesions were not visible on a radiograph, they should not be treated. Conservative? Absolutely. And the whole issue was about, okay, simple restorative, there's nothing showed up on the x-ray, but on my treatment plan I had indicated that some simple restorative was done. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but documentation is very important as far as medical necessity. It's essential. Major services needed pre-approval, so anything that I did major, like root canals, crowns, bridges, that had to be pre-approved, so there was no issue with that at all. Work not present, so their expert in the classroom with a flashlight had done an evaluation comparing what we'd billed to what they'd seen. They had indicated that there were cases where they looked at the patient and could not see the restoration that was placed, which to me would be direct fraud, correct? I billed for something that wasn't there. So we brought those same patients back into our office. We had a dentist who came in with loupes and headlights in our clinic and did that evaluation and found the restorations that the other dentist did not find. So in fact, the restorations that I bill for were in the patient's mouth. So they didn't agree. How about, some people will always throw stones in your path. It depends on what you make with them, a wall or a bridge. Remember, you're the architect. Especially if you're very successful, especially in today's market, and your colleagues don't necessarily work as hard as you do, or engaged as hard as you do, or invest in CE like this for the staff so that you are better than most in the area, there's a jealousy piece going on there, so they're going to toss rocks. Anytime somebody says something negative, it's because they want to bring you down, as one of our other speakers said. Never let that happen. Use that to be able to fortify what you do. And I would be fearless. If somebody makes a complaint, review that and say, is there validity in that? And there may be. And if that's the case, make the correction. Second, billing for services. We routinely sent claims after 30 days that were unpaid. For some reason, infrequently, but this did happen sometimes. If we billed 30 days later, we drop another one, and sometimes they would pay for both. We didn't change anything on the claim form, same claim number, same treatment date, everything was exactly a duplicate claim. We would get paid. Should we have sent that back? Absolutely. Unbundling. There was a Panorex series in Virginia where the Panorex and Bite Wings was to be billed together with a proprietary number. We didn't know there were two separate codes for that. There never was in the CDT code. But here again, lesson to you, you need to know what the contract says, and if it says you have to bill a particular way, you have to do that. Today, as far as unbundling, would be, for example, you're doing an endodontic procedure. The diagnostic film is billable. The treatment films are not. That would be unbundling. Some people will bill for provisional crowns. That should be part of that regular crown if it's been done in a reasonable amount of time. So be careful about breaking things down, pulling things out pieces and parts. That can be considered unbundling. Restoration billed multiple dates, multiple services. They had an expert witness who testified that if a restoration was placed well and appropriately, it should last forever. That's what I said, forever. Our patients, what do they think? If a tooth fractures or a filling comes out after a restoration is placed, whose fault is it? It's the dentist, right? So there again, that's that uphill climb when they have an expert that testifies that, and that just feeds into what they believe anyway. So is that difficult to turn around? Absolutely. If it's not important to you, if it is important to you, you'll find a way. If it's not important to you, you'll find an excuse. It's like, I can't do that because this happened or that happened. If it's truly important to you, you'll make sure it happens. If a child needs a treatment that you know is available, will you do whatever's necessary to make it happen? It absolutely will. So just FYI. Worthless services. Issue was with an endodontic procedure. I'd done a root canal. The tooth had to be extracted a year and a half afterward. The prosecution's position was that I provided a worthless service for the patient. It had to be extracted. We had a 94% success rate with our endo. We did a boatload of molar endo because frequently that patient came in on their first appointment, an 8 or 9-year-old with a blown out molar that we needed to do a endo core buildup and crown on. So we did a number of endo, and even though I was able to substantiate there was a 94% success rate, they had an expert witness. This was a licensed dentist who said that they had never had an endodontic procedure fail. That was my response. I kind of groaned, and just to let you know how what we do is a little bit confusing to lay people, I groaned, and my attorney during the next break, he said, what was your reaction about that root canal thing that doctor was talking about, not having a failure? And I said, even the best of root canals are going to fail at a certain percentage. And he looked at me and goes, really? Just to let you know, that's what our patients think. Have you ever had a patient who had a root canal and thought that it's going to be good forever? There should never be anything else happen to it. How in the world is it hurting now? And why does it need to be extracted? There again, that's that uphill climb. Also had patients, if they had restorable primary teeth and they were going to last a significant amount of time and they were decayed, I would do pulpotomies and crowns on them. They had an expert testified, a dentist, that said if a primary tooth were decayed to any great extent, it needed to be extracted. Shouldn't be restored. You know, if that was a child of mine, I want them to keep their teeth as long as possible to help hold space for and to give them something to chew with. But there again, have you ever had a parent that you're going over a treatment plan with and the parent goes, well, is that just a baby tooth you're wanting to do the filling on? Well, just pull it. And if you have a parent who is on the jury who is working and they don't have insurance and they're paying their taxes and the tax money is going to fund this doctor who is providing Cadillac treatment for these patients, and my tax money is doing that, and I can't even afford to take my child to the dentist, and this other professional says it needs to be extracted anyway, and he's doing this. Can you see where, from their point of view, it would be abuse? I'm just telling you. Double billing, primary and secondary coverage. If they had primary, and some of our patients would have conventional insurance, so we'd send that to the conventional first, get the EOB back, staple it to the primary claim, send it to Medicaid, and occasionally they would pay the Medicaid payment as if there were no primary insurance. They didn't adjust it appropriately. Should we have found that? We absolutely should have. We didn't. And I encourage you, our staff was bonused on the particular area of their practice, so if their collections were 98% or better, they got their bonus. So if they got a payment that they weren't entitled to, and I don't believe this is the case in my practice at all. Please hear me correctly. I don't think my staff did this. However, if there was a payment that was received that we weren't entitled to and they were close on their bonuses, would there be a benefit to that staff member to send it back? No. Make sure your systems encourage positive, good behavior, maybe not so bad. So was I guilty? At this point, it really doesn't matter. Did I get money I wasn't entitled to, and according to the letter of the law, was I guilty? I stand before you a man who was guilty of healthcare fraud. I can't say I wasn't. They did prove it. I did get money I was entitled to, so I stand before you a guilty man. But I may not have gone where I intended to go, but I think I've ended up where I was supposed to be. Hope you feel that way too in your practices. I hope you're there because you feel like that's your home and that's where your highest and best use is. If not, you owe it to yourself and to your team and to your doctor to make a change. There's no point in being there if you're not there for the right reasons. What I learned during the trial about record keeping, you need to be defensive. If it's not in your clinical record, it wasn't seen, it wasn't said, it wasn't heard, it didn't need to be done, it wasn't done, it doesn't exist from a legal perspective. Those documents can testify for you loudly, strongly, and accurately if you determine you're going to make note where you need to. Otherwise, it's he said, she said. One of the issues was a restorative procedure that I did, and I took the stand. I supported all those 118 instances that they had indicated it could be healthcare fraud. And it got to the point where I was doing simple restorative, and the question was asked me, Dr. Shelburne, my attorney asked me, what do you determine or use to determine what's necessary when you treat a tooth? And I said, well, multiple factors. I said, we first take a look at the mouth. A lot of times cavities can be visual. We have an explorer. We can touch the tooth. If it's decayed or if it's unhealthy, the explorer will kind of catch in that area. It'll be rough and make it sticky into the soft part. You know, we take radiographs. Sometimes they show the lesion, sometimes they don't. We have SoPro, Diagnodet, whatever that might be. And spent a long time explaining the process. And then it became the prosecutor's turn to kind of disassemble everything I'd said. So the prosecutor got to this point for this patient, and he looked at me and he said, Dr. Shelburne, you did an amazing job describing what you did to list what you went through to be able to determine treatment was necessary. By the way, if a prosecutor ever compliments you, what comes next is not going to be pretty. Saw it coming. So he nodded at his AV person. They clicked and put up a copy of my record. And he said, Doctor, for the sake of the jury, can you identify the date where you did the evaluation of this patient? And I did. I pointed. I said, this is the date. And it had evaluation and it had a list of the treatment that I suggested for the patient. And they said, could you identify on the day that you provided treatment, what day was that? And it had the day and the treatment that I provided. He said, Doctor, for the sake of the jury, can you point to or identify that you did any of those things that you suggested you typically do to determine treatment's necessary? I looked at it, and I said, I didn't make note of any of those things. He turned to the jury with a small grin on his face, and he said, well, I guess now that we find you in this position, we'll just have to take your word for it that you did those things, right? Had I taken more time to actually identify a diagnosis and reason for treatment, that would have been taken off the table. It would not be an issue anymore. Did I take the time to do that? Never. You know, I thought, I'm a dentist, I'm a clinician, everybody would trust me. That doesn't happen anymore. The level of trust for professionals has decreased exponentially. Nobody trusts anybody anymore. So if it's not in that clinical record, it does not exist. So who does the charting? Doctors, your highest and best use is either educating a patient or treating a patient. It's not making a clinical note. Every member of the staff should be involved, trained, but doctors hear this. That's not something on Monday morning you go to your staff and say, oh, we're going to start letting you chart, so go. If you do that, I will come to your place and I will rip you another one. Train your staff. Teach them, number one, develop your expectations. We'll get to the 7 points of a compliance system in a little bit, but you need to establish your expectations. What should we develop? If you want a tool to be able to do that, I'll send that to you. Like I said, email, I will not spam you. I'll only send you what you want or need. But I'll send you a tool that will help to give you a framework. Be careful about your templates. Templates can be very dangerous. There was an office in Arizona. They had a hygienist that did an amazing job putting their templates together. One of their templates was for a healthy patient who, was pretty clean when they came in. It said that the patient came in, there was no plaque, no tartar, no inflammation. Patient was healthy. They did prophies and fluorides for those patients. A patient who has no plaque, no tartar, and no inflammation, should they get a prophy? From a medical necessity point of view, that would be a no, and they ask for all the money back for those patients. What they do, for example, radiographs, huge issue. They feel that radiographs are being abused. To establish a criterion that is, number one, for the radiographs, it needs to be medically necessary, not because the insurance will pay for them. My greatest hope when I do a review and I see the note in a chart, and this happens a lot, radiographs not due. And I hope to ask this doctor and say, what does this mean, radiographs are not due? And I hope the answer would be, well, we review the patient's history, the risk factors, and determine that at this point the patient does not need the radiographs based on how they presented. That's never been the response. It's always been, well, it means that the insurance doesn't pay for them. Never base your treatment hinged on when an insurance company will pay for it. If you want to know a baseline for radiographs, the FDA and the ADA in 2008, updated in 2012, put together a document that explains the criterion for where they have a grid, risk factors on one side, age of the patient on the other, and it gives you a base, kind of a standard of care, to be able to expose those radiographs. Can you deviate from that? You absolutely can, but there needs to be a medical necessity. So number one, when you take a radiograph, the medical necessity needs to be established. Number two, that they were taken and that they are diagnostic. There was a dentist who submitted a PA to help support the need for a crown. PA was not a very good one. Sent to the insurance company, the consultant who reviewed the claim looked at this PA and said, if they think this is diagnostic, I wonder when we get to this office and do an audit, how many other radiographs we find that are non-diagnostic that they billed for. They did that. They pulled 20 charts and they found out that 15% of the radiographs that this office had taken and billed for were non-diagnostic. So they used that 15% number to multiply by the entire global payment for all the radiographs to this office for 6 years. Because the statute of limitation is 6 years, this office wrote a check back to the insurance company for $72,000. That's the way they work now. They extrapolate. If you're in network with that insurance company, the contract says you write that check without question. Can you negotiate that? Sometimes you can. Can you ask for an appeal? You sometimes can. But if they have the substantiated the fact that those are non-diagnostic, okay, I'm going to get in your stuff a little bit here because of the documentation piece. I'm going to chase a rabbit for just a second. Got an hour. So patient comes in, pain on the upper right-hand side. Patient's complaining of pain. Doctor does a quick review, asks the assistant to take the PA. First PA is taken, and the doctor reviews it. It's not the best. It's kind of good, but not a really good one. So the doctor says, I want you to take another one, please. The second one's taken, and I know this never happens in your practice, but the second one's worse than the first. That doesn't happen, does it? So the third one's taken, and it's perfect. How many do you bill for? 1. How many do you make note were taken? 3. This is going to do 2 things. Number 1, you need to track your patient's exposure to radiographs, and you also need to track how effective your staff is at taking those radiographs. So if you have a staff member that's taking 5 to get 1, that's an opportunity to educate, to bring the standard of care up. Ask and track what you want to follow. Don't click, delete, click, delete, click, delete. 10 minutes? Oh, wow. Oh, it is 12:30. I had an hour. Everybody's going, okay, that's got it straight. So, I'm almost done anyway. So, doctors, train your staff. Make sure that they understand what's going on, how it's doing. When you do that, I'm going to get to the 7 points of the compliance program and then let you guys out of here because I know what time is about. The audit tools that I talk about here, I'm going to go ahead and send you, so don't worry about that. What I want you to see is the compliance program that you need to think and develop into your practice. I get wound up sometimes, so sorry about that. You'll just have to have me back, Chris. That's all. That's okay. Come back again. Thank you. But I'll send you, if you'll send me an email, I'll send you all of this. So, compliance program. Number one, you need to determine, and hopefully after you've listened to this, that you need a program. Number two, your expectations. Doctors, that's a conversation with your staff. This is our expectations. These are how we're going to do them. Number three, you need to identify a person in your practice that is going to carry through. If you have a person in charge, it will happen. You respond appropriately. Training and education there, again, piece of it you can't do without. Respond appropriately. When you find something like these radiographs that are not diagnostic and one person is doing a number of those, figure out what you're going to do about that. Open lines of communication. Doctors, you may be the problem. You may be doing something in your practice that's not allowing the staff to deliver what your expectations are. Allow them feedback. Enforcing disciplinary standards, and there again, you need to be ready to cut bait and run. If that staff member is not able to meet the expectations, you bring down the level of that practice. So you have to be very concerned about that. So let's say goodbye by introducing you to the most important thing in my life. That's my family. This picture was taken in the federal prison camp in Manchester, Kentucky. We sent Christmas cards every single year, and this year was no exception. That amazing, beautiful young lady in the middle is my wife of 37 years. She worked in my office for about 6 months. It became clear I could have an office person or a wife. I couldn't have both. She visited me while I was in prison every single weekend except one, and the weather was so bad that one weekend that even the guards couldn't get in and out. That is a picture of unconditional love. I will tell you, you'll not see any deeper anyplace else. Divorce is not something we would ever consider. Murder's not out of the question. This young man standing next to her, I talked about my children and how they were affected by the whole thing. That's my son, Ross. Ross graduated from dental school in May 2008 when I surrendered my license in 2008 in July. He came to my practice and his only complaint has ever been that he's too busy. And this young man has more character in his little finger than I will in my whole body. Because we were upside down in our mortgage on our house, the government couldn't sell it and get anything for it, so this young man paid his mother's mortgage so she could have a home for 3 years. Yes, absolutely. He sent checks to his sisters who were still in college on either side to give them a little bit of extra money so they could do what they wanted to, without a consideration ever for himself. That's Dr. Ross Shelburne. This young lady on the end here, that's my middle daughter. She's the one that stood up with her finger in my face. That's Dr. Erica Shelburne. She's a pediatrician. She graduated from the Arnold Palmer Hospital for Children residency program in Orlando, Florida. She's in Harrisonburg, Virginia as a pediatric hospitalist. And they asked them, the first week they're there, they have a retreat and asked them why they have become pediatric or pediatricians. And she said, as she stood, my dad. My dad treated children. He was a dentist without any regard for anything other than their care. And to be honest with you, he's in prison now because he had that dedication. Love my dad, and I'm proud of him, and he's the reason why I am a pediatrician. Yeah, thank you. And that young lady on the end, that is Dr. Emily Shelburne. She's a doctor of audiology. This is a wedding picture. That's my new son. That's Noel. Visitation, my wife orchestrated that, so I knew who was coming and when they were coming. And he showed up one day unannounced. And he sat, as I sat next to him at that visitation room, and I asked him, why are you here? He was really nervous. And he said, well, I respect you, and I love Emily. So do you mind if I marry your daughter, if I ask her to marry me? I said, no, you absolutely can't. No, I didn't say that. And the cool thing is that if you've been approved to come visit in a federal prison, you can't have a criminal background. So I found my future son-in-law did not have a criminal background, which was good for me as a parent, but not so good for... So, questions. This is the last. This is Shanley. That's our latest edition. Ross got married in Disney in March. So he now has a helpmate. 3 things in life to be truly happy. Number 1, someone to love. I hope you all have at least one someone to love. Number 2, something to do. You guys have a lot to do after being here this weekend, a lot of things to do. Prioritize those and go home and work it. The most important thing first, once you get that under your belt, maybe the next one or the third one, don't try to do them all at the same thing. And the third thing is something to look forward to. I hope you all have a bright future. Don't let all the gloom and doom bring you down. Only be fearful if you're not willing to take action and move forward to that. And lastly, as far as my dental license, it was revoked. Minimum amount of time for a revocation in the state of Virginia is 3 years. I was able to reapply in July of 2011. I did 300 hours of CE. I went to VCU, rotated through the different departments for 61 hours. Doctors, I took my boards over again. Yes, after 31 years. Passed them. Woo. Yeah. Went before the Board of Dentistry, gave all my evidence. They had me leave the room. They deliberated for an hour and 45 minutes. They called me back in again, and the chairman of the board stood and he said, Dr. Shelburne, this is probably one of the most difficult decisions we've ever had to make. We talked, we fought, but we did come to a conclusion. We've decided to restore your license to practice dentistry. So I can do it again. The thing I love, second best to my people I love is to be able to do dentistry. The thing I want to leave you here with, I lost the ability to practice dentistry. I took that amazing gift for granted every day I sat in that practice. Never do that again. We all have an opportunity, regardless of what you do in the practice, be part of a team that ultimately changes lives. Don't take that for granted. Go home, enjoy your family, and be thankful for what you have, because it can be taken away in an instant, but it can be restored if you're willing to do that. Thank you, Mayans, for having me here. Thank you all for being here.